Hello, everybody who's waiting. Thank you for joining us this evening. We will go live in just 1 minute. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Global Script Regime, Writing Systems and Writing Technologies in Modern Japan. I'm Grace Gailey, here live from New York City with the Japan Foundation New York's Japanese Studies team. Thank you so much for joining us for this evening's lecture. Tonight is the second lecture in our new series titled Illuminating Japanese Studies, lecture series with former Japan Foundation Fellows. This series explores the world of Japanese studies with former recipients of our Japan Foundation Japanese Studies Fellowship Award. Since the program began in 1972, there have been more than 1,000 American fellowship recipients. From pre-modern history to pop culture and everything in between, this series will explore what Japanese studies can teach us, not only about Japan, but about the world. To learn more about our fellowship funding opportunities, please see the link in our description box below this video. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Raja Adal. Dr. Adal is an assistant professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh. Seed funding for this position was provided by the Japan Foundation New York's Institutional Project Support Grant. Dr. Adal has also been awarded our Short-Term Research Fellowship in 2010 and our Long-Term Research Fellowship in 2015. His current book project focuses on the global history of scripts and writing technologies in the 20th century, with a specific focus on Japan. The Q&A following our lecture will be moderated by Dr. Kay Shimizu. Dr. Shimizu is a research assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Pittsburgh and a visiting scholar at the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies in Japan. Her research addresses institutional design and their effects on economic governance, with a special interest in central-local relations, property rights, and the digital transformation. For more information about our speakers and our moderator, again, please see that description box below this video. I have a few housekeeping notes before we begin. First, as I mentioned, the lecture will be followed by a live Q&A session. We will be collecting your questions and comments throughout the video, throughout the lecture, in the YouTube chat box, which you will find again below this video. We ask that you keep that chat box clean, respectful, and friendly, and we strongly encourage you to submit your questions freely. Second, per the United States and Japan's copyright laws, the images and media clips shown in this presentation are for the sole purpose and are limited to the extent necessary for academic discussion. Sources can be found in the description box below this video. As a nonprofit organization, Japan Foundation does not profit from this video. Now let's begin the lecture. We'll be back in a moment for the Q&A. See you soon.
There are languages, and languages are spoken. And then there are scripts. Scripts are written. English is usually written with the Latin script, but so are most other languages in Europe, the Americas, Africa, and elsewhere. There's also the Arabic script, the Devanagari script, Hiragana, a syllabary that is part of the Japanese script, and countless other scripts. According to the largest dataset of world languages, there are 7,468 languages and 128 scripts in the world today. For every script, there are 58 languages. In a seminal paper, David Damrosch thought of users of the same script as participating in a common script world. He argued that it's much more common for works of literature to be translated and spread among languages that use the same script than across different scripts. World literature, he argued, was influenced as much by the spread of scripts as by the spread of languages. We need to think of the world not just in terms of languages, but of script worlds. Now, I'd like to borrow the concept of script worlds from David Damrosch and put all of the script worlds on a single map. At any moment in history, all of these script worlds taken together make up the global script regime. This is the first part of the talk, and it's about the global script regime today. The second part will move backwards in time and talk about the global script regime in history. And then the third and fourth parts will move to talking about writing technologies. The third part is about writing technologies before and after the age of the typewriter. And the fourth part is about writing technologies during the age of the typewriter, focusing specifically on the Chinese character typewriter in Japan. The fifth part will come back to talking about the global script regime, except it won't talk about it in the present or in the past, but in the future. First, however, I'd like to thank the Japan Foundation for supporting my work and that of so many other scholars, teachers, and students. I'd like to start by looking at our current script regime and using it to imagine the various script regimes of the past. I'll be using a map that I created using ArcGIS and Adobe Illustrator from a dataset of world languages by SIL Ethnologue. I'd like to acknowledge the support of the University of Pittsburgh libraries in helping me to acquire this dataset, and the invaluable assistance of three people, Finn Henrik Barton, Vicky Shen, and Mats Waden, in helping me to map this dataset. This is the world of Latin characters today, at the beginning of the 21st century. Each dot represents 1 million people. When the speakers of a working language primarily use the Latin script to write their language, their population shows up on this map as a green dot. In order to limit the number of scripts to something that can be represented on a map, only the scripts used to write working languages were included on this map. What's a working language? By working languages, I mean the languages that are used by either national or regional governments for the daily business of government. These are the scripts that are used to write the languages that you can use to get a birth certificate or a driver's license. This is the world of Arabic characters, used to write the Arabic language, but also Persian, Urdu, and various other languages. This is the world of Devanagari characters, used to write Hindi, Nepali, and various other languages. And this is the world of Chinese characters, used to write, with some modifications and additions of course, the Chinese, Japanese, and Korean languages. If we put these 4 scripts, along with every script used to write a working language on the map, here's what our map looks like. The Latin, Arabic, Devanagari, and Chinese scripts are the most popular scripts in the world. It may look like there are just as many users of the Cyrillic script as of the Devanagari script, but that's due to the fact that the users of the Devanagari script are concentrated on a much smaller area, forcing some of the dots on top of each other. Here's another visualization which represents the same data in a different way. Like the map, it shows the scripts that are used to write the working languages of the world population of users, except that it does not do so on a map, but with bubbles of different sizes. The most common script, the Latin script, is used by about 40% of the world population to write their first language. The Chinese script is used by about 20% of the world population, and by about 23% if we include Japanese and Korean as part of the Chinese script world. The Arabic script is used by about 12% of the world population, and the Devanagari script is used by about 8% of the world population. Together, these four scripts, the Latin, Arabic, Devanagari, and Chinese scripts, account for between 80 and 83% of the world's population. They're followed by scripts used to write other national languages, like Bengali or Cyrillic, by scripts used to write regional languages, in gray, like Telugu and Gujarati, and by scripts used to write languages which are not the working languages of a national or regional government, in black, like Kaiti, Tifinagh, and Nko. This bubble chart, much like the map that I showed earlier, is a way to visualize the global script regime today. So this is the world script regime today. But what about the world script regime from 100 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago? Well, we don't have data for back then. In fact, we don't really even have data for a decade or two ago that's reliable. But we can use the data that we have for today to go back in time and try to imagine the world script regimes of the past. Let's take another look at this map and first of all, try to imagine the birth, expansion, and then contraction of the world of Latin characters. The history of Latin characters would have to begin with the Roman Empire. Latin characters accompanied Roman legions as they spread through what we would now call Europe. A few centuries later, the New Testament was translated from Greek to Latin, and the Roman Empire became the Holy Western Roman Empire. In this way, Latin written with Latin characters acquired a special status in Western Christendom as the language and script of the church, of the elite, and of orthodox knowledge. In the successor states of the Western Roman Empire, Latin soon gave way to vernaculars like French, English, and German. But the Latin script did not give way to any other scripts. It became the dominant script in Europe. Despite these successes, if we were to map the global script regime around 1500, some 2 millennium after its birth, the Latin script would still only occupy a relatively small portion of the globe. The worlds of Arabic and Chinese characters were still much larger and more populous. The spread of Latin characters beyond Europe only began in earnest in the late 15th and 16th century, when they accompanied Western armies, merchants, missionaries, and settlers to the Americas, Asia, and Africa. During these journeys, Latin characters encountered a multitude of different languages. Some were not usually written, and Latin scripts provided the technology for writing them. Others, such as Mayan, written with the Maya script, were written, but their writing system was primarily intended to convey particular concepts related to specific fields such as astronomy. Latin characters provided a more flexible technology and are used for writing Mayan today. In other cases still, Latin characters replaced other world scripts, such as the Arabic script that was used to write Malay-Indonesian, or the Chinese characters that were used in what is today Vietnam. In this way, and with the help of a variety of accents, diacritics, and other marks, Latin characters came to be used to write thousands of languages across the world. In the Ethnologue dataset, we can count 3,391 languages written with the Latin script. The global career of Latin characters reached its zenith sometime during the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries. At the height of European colonial empires, Colonial administrators in much of what is today the world of Arabic characters and the world of Devanagari characters used European languages written with the Latin script. Obtaining a birth certificate or a certificate of land ownership in colonial Algeria or India, for example, required writing with Latin characters. With the rise of independence movements, however, the world of Latin characters shrank again. Post-colonial state from North Africa to West Asia, South Asia, and elsewhere often switched from colonial languages written with Latin characters to languages like Arabic or Hindi written with non-Latin scripts. By the second half of the 20th century, the boundaries of the world of Latin characters were largely similar to the ones on this map. In this history of the Latin script, religion, in this case the Christian religion, empire, everything from the Roman Empire to modern European empires, and the nation state really take center stage. And these three, religion, empire, and the nation state, are central to the history of most scripts. Take, for example, Chinese characters. Some of the first texts in Chinese characters are found on bones. Ox bones or turtle bones, known as oracle bones because they were used to divine the future. Chinese writing spread on the wings of military, political, and economic and cultural expansion throughout East and Southeast Asia. Just like in the case of the Latin script, religion, empire, and nation states have played a predominant role in the history of the Chinese script. We've talked about the role of religions, of empires, of nation states in the global history of scripts. Is there anything else? Well, there is identity. Individuals seeking to perpetuate their tradition could teach their children to write particular scripts. But think of it. Would you teach your child to write a script that they can't use at work and that they cannot use to obtain a driver's license, for example? Well, perhaps, but it would have to be a conscious decision to transmit a particular tradition. So in addition to religions, empires, nation states, and identity, is there anything else that is important to the history of scripts? I've personally been long fascinated by the role that technology plays in the script regime. For much of the history of writing, for several millennia, the same writing instruments could be used to write any script. For example, the reed brush, the soft hair brush, the stylus, the pen, the pencil, the fountain pen, they can all be used to write any script and to draw anything for that matter. In fact, for much of human history, writing was a form of drawing. In woodblock prints, for example, texts and images could be seamlessly combined for the simple reason that the text was an image. One can imagine any number of scripts and images all combined on a single woodblock print. With the movable type printing press, this was no longer the case. A printer could only use the letters in the job case, which was a drawer in which the types were held. A printer of Latin text would have one set of drawers, one of Arabic characters, another larger one, and a printer of Chinese text would have the largest one, which would have to contain the thousands of characters used in Chinese and other languages that use Chinese characters. With the movable type printing press, text was no longer an image. Each text was, instead, a series of rows of discrete letters. Like the movable type printing press, typewriters had a limited character set. If one wanted to type a different script, one had to switch to a different typewriter. These are some of the keyboards that were produced by Godrej and Boyce in India, courtesy of the Godrej Archive in Mumbai. The same could be said of the word processors, which in the 1970s and 1980s replaced typewriters. This is the first word processor for the Japanese language that was commercialized. It was much more practical than a Chinese character typewriter, and its successors became smaller and cheaper. But they still could only type two scripts, the Japanese script and the Latin script. Arabic word processors were also limited to typing two scripts, the Arabic script and the Latin script. And computers could also only type two scripts. I remember being a graduate student in Japan in the 1990s studying Middle Eastern studies. Japanese scholars of Middle Eastern studies in the 1990s often had two computers, one for typing Japanese and English, the other one for typing Arabic. For these scholars, Windows 2000 was a breakthrough because it allowed them to only have one machine that could type Japanese, English, and Arabic. The reason was that Windows 2000 used Unicode. This chart shows the percentage of world languages that various versions of Unicode could write. You can see here that with the first version of the Unicode standard in 1993, it suddenly became possible to write and display 23 scripts on any Unicode-compatible device. Within 6 years of the first Unicode version in 1999, Unicode 3.0 provided support for the scripts of all national working languages in the world and for the scripts used to write the first language of about 98% of the world's population. By the time Unicode 13 was published in 2020, the number of scripts writable on a single machine had risen to 154 and counting. Now, Unicode is not sufficient. You also need fonts. Unicode does not encode the font. And it's really nice to also have search functionality, to have spell checkers, to have voice recognition. But I think there's no doubt that smaller scripts, which often didn't have a typewriter, are better off in the days of Unicode than in the days of the typewriter. With the Unicode standard, we once again have a technology that can write, maybe not any script, but almost any script. Of the 154 scripts that are Unicode compatible, those scripts cover the vast majority of scripts that are written even by smaller communities today, and a large number of historical scripts also. So now we once again have a technology which, just like the days of the stylus, the reed pen, the soft hairbrush, the pencil, the pen, which has the ability to write and draw on the same computer screen. We once again have a technology that makes text into an image. So we've talked about three things so far: the global script regime today, the global script regime in history, and writing technologies before and after the age of the typewriter, when text was still an image. With a pen or pencil, one can write any script. Today, with a computer or smartphone, one can also write any script, dozens of scripts, easily. But during the age of the typewriter, one typewriter could only type one script, and with the word processor and early computers, one word processor or computer could only, at least not easily, type more than two scripts. So my question is, why were typewriters such a commercial success? If they're so impractical, why use them? This is, I think, more true than ever with the Chinese character typewriter, which was the most impractical typewriter in the world. Here you can see the first Chinese character Japanese typewriter that was commercialized in 1916. This is the patent for that typewriter. You can kind of get a sense of the complexity of the machine, but you can also have a look at the tray bed in which you had all of the characters that this typewriter used. It used more than 3,000 characters, which made for a very large machine that was very heavy, that was very expensive, which was quite complicated to operate. You needed about 6 months of part-time training in order to be able to operate this machine. So here's a video that I took which shows someone using this Chinese character Japanese typewriter. So you can see this typewriter wasn't the most practical, but it was a considerable consumer success. It sold tens of thousands of machines every year for several decades. In this graph, you can see in 1951, it sells what? Just under 10,000 machines? And this rises to over 80,000 in 1980. The peak that you see in 1984 is artificial. It's because they were about to go out of business and they had announced that these were their last typewriters. And so therefore, there was a rush to buy these typewriters before they went out of business because word processors were becoming increasingly popular. Now, of course, the numbers of Chinese character Japanese typewriters sold in post-war Japan does not compare to the number of Latin character typewriters that are sold worldwide. Here you have the number of Latin character typewriters produced in the US and then also produced in Japan. And you can see it's in the millions. So, the millions obviously doesn't compare to the, a few tens of thousands of Chinese character Japanese typewriters. But you have to put it in context. I mean, Latin character typewriters were used by individuals. They were very portable. They were cheap. It wasn't just Mark Twain who used them. Students, scholars, everybody had a typewriter sitting at home. This was not the case for Chinese character typewriters in Japan. They were used primarily by large businesses, by government bureaucracies, by schools, and later on in the post-war period, they were also used by medium and smaller businesses. But considering how impractical and expensive they were, I think we still need to ask, why were they so popular? Why didn't people simply write by hand? So in order to answer the question of why was such an impractical machine such a commercial success, I decided to look at one of the largest, if not the largest, business archive in modern Japan, which is the Mitsui Miike Mine Archive. It's a mining archive, and the documents look like this. This archive runs from 1889 to 1940 and consists of more than 30,000 documents, which allows me to do both a distant and a close reading. A distant reading is using digital methods to analyze a large body of texts. And this allows me to get an overview of what's in the entire archive. At the same time, I'm also doing a close reading, which is reading closely individual texts. Now, as you can see, the documents in this archive are written with a number of writing instruments. You have the brush, the pen, the pencil, the typewriter, and this allows me to contextualize the typewriter within the context of other writing instruments that were being used in this company, but also in other large companies in modern Japan and also in the government bureaucracy. It also allows me to contextualize the typewriter within instruments of reproduction. So there were, before the copier, there were instruments such as the hectograph, the mimeograph, the printing press, and understanding the typewriter in relation to these instruments of reproduction makes it possible to understand the role that the typewriter played within the circulation of documents in the office. So I haven't done this research yet. This is really initial work, and I'm just giving you a bit of a preview of some of the things that I see coming up. There are 4 things that I see as key: the production of texts, the storage and circulation of texts, the consumption of texts, and what I call the print sublime. With the typewriter, there comes a reorganization, a reapportion of the labor of writing. In Japan, it used to be like most managers wrote their own letters by their own hands. In some cases, they had amanuenses who wrote for them, but that was rather the exception rather than the rule. With typewriters, it becomes quite common, in fact, most common, I think, for managers to jot down something on a piece of paper and then send it to the typewriter pool, and there it would be typed up. This was somewhat different from Europe and North America, the world of Latin characters, where in most cases managers dictated to a stenographer and then the stenographer typed up what her notes. The concern is fairly similar. The concern is how to remove some of the labor, some of the physical labor of writing from the manager and transfer it to a typist, a stenographer, a subordinate. Now, there's another very interesting aspect to this story, and it's the fact that in North America, in Europe, and also in Japan, the vast majority of typists were women. In this graph, you can see this overwhelming proportion in Japan. And so essentially what is happening is that you have male managers who are transferring the physical labor of writing onto female typists. This is one of the topics that I would like to look into in more detail. The second topic that I'm interested in is the way in which the typewriter influences the storage and circulation of documents in the office. Now, this is an age before copy machines, when there are various methods of copying, but they're often quite imperfect and messy. There is, of course, copying by hand, right, which is time and labor consuming. There is the hectograph, the mimeograph, the printing press, of course, for large numbers of copies, and also carbon paper. Now, the typewriter is especially well suited for carbon paper because it's very easy to put, up to 5, 6, 7 sheets of paper with carbon paper in between, place them in the typewriter, and then you have one original and several copies. And so my hypothesis is that with the typewriter, we inaugurate what today we would call CC, carbon copies. Carbon copies become much more common with a typewriter, and this results in a revolution, really, in the way in which documents are circulating around the office. It becomes much more common to store one copy of a document and to circulate other copies to various departments within the company. The third topic that I'm interested in is the way in which the typewriter influences the consumption of texts, basically people reading the text. Obviously, the typewriter, like the printing press, creates a printed document, which is easier to read, but it's not easier to read in the same way for everyone. For highly trained managers who have the education and have the cultural capital, who are really used to reading cursive script, it is not that much more work to read handwritten letters with a brush in a flowing cursive kuzushiji style. However, for people who do not have that training, for people who are more on the outer fringes of company culture, it's, I think, quite a bit easier, or at least I'm hypothesizing that it's quite a bit easier for them to read documents that are printed than to read documents that are handwritten. One can visualize this as concentric circles surrounding a document. The degree of accessibility to a document depends on one's position along the rungs of these circles. The fourth and last topic that I'm interested in is what I call the print sublime. And this is the idea that print, whether produced on a printing press or on a typewriter, becomes the standard visual language of official documents, of formal documents, of bureaucracies, of business. One can see this in two quotes drawn from outside of the Mitsui Minike mine and drawn from outside of Japan, for that matter. The first one is by Martin Heidegger, who was observing the way in which the typewriter became the standard instrument for writing in the world of Latin characters. He wrote, "In the time of the first dominance of the typewriter, a letter written on this machine still stood for a breach of good manners. Today, a handwritten letter is an antiquated and undesired thing. It disturbs speed reading." Heidegger was far from the only person to notice this. Countless observers note that typewritten letters go from being this oddity, something that people complain about, to becoming the standard visual language of official documents. An Egyptian scientific journal, a few decades earlier, essentially noted the same thing. This instrument, the Arabic typewriter, that's what they're talking about, will no doubt encounter some opposition in the beginning, much like the Latin typewriter at its beginning. We have learned that European political periodicals once refused typewritten articles, but the situation has been reversed, and now they mandate that submitted articles be typewritten or else ignored. So in North America and Europe, I think it's in the very last decade of the 19th century that the typewriter imposes itself as the standard instrument for writing official documents. In Japan, of course, the first typewriter is only commercialized in 1916, but I think the same process might very well be occurring, and the typewriter replaces the brush as the standard instrument for official documents. Now, what's very interesting here is that the brush becomes what's called remediated. The brush acquires a new function in a world in which official documents are produced on a typewriter. And this is one of the things that I would like to explore. Outside of Japan, I've observed that newly independent states like Lebanon or India, used typewriters. In fact, typewriters were essential in these newly decolonized states in order to give their indigenous languages authority. So when Lebanon switches from having its laws typed up in French to using French and Arabic, you have to bring in typewriters because that Arabic cannot be handwritten. The same thing when India decides to adopt Hindi written in Devanagari characters. They are very concerned about providing their bureaucracy with Devanagari typewriters because otherwise the textual production of the government would be seen as informal, unofficial, and unworthy of the standard of formality that English written with Latin characters and typed up on Latin typewriters enjoys. So my conclusion here is that typewriters, non-Latin typewriters especially, were quite crucial in making non-Latin scripts acceptable in the modern world, to legitimizing them and to giving them the formal authority that European languages written in a Latin script enjoyed. So this is ongoing research, but what I'm doing here is I'm exploring the relationship between, on the one hand, the global script regime and technologies of writing, in particular the typewriter. And I'm especially looking at non-Latin typewriters and in the ways in which these typewriters and the struggle to produce them and to commercialize them and to use them relates to the struggle of non-Latin scripts for survival in the modern world. Now, I look at government bureaucracies across the globe, in various archives in the Middle East, in South Asia, and in Japan, of course. But I also look at a single company archive, the Mitsui Meike Mine archive, in order to understand the mechanics, the way in which instruments of writing transformed over this period, and in the way in which they transformed the way that companies operated, that writing was produced, was stored, was circulated, was consumed, and what it meant to have writing that was formal and that had authority. So this is looking at not just the content, the semantic content of writing, but also looking at the aesthetic appearance of writing. Now, one question, a very difficult question that we can ask, is what will the script regime of the future look like? So we looked at the script regimes of the present. We looked at script regimes of the past. Well, how about the future? This is the kind of question that historians don't usually answer or even ask, because we're not astrologists, right? We don't look into the future. But I think that implicitly, the way in which we understand the past affects the way in which we imagine the future. Whether we talk about the future or not, it's always in the back of our minds, because it's our ways of framing the past really affect the ways in which we imagine and the ways in which the people who read us imagine the future. It was really only with the age of the typewriter that typing a different script required a different machine, an entirely different machine. So the age of the typewriter, I think, is a unique moment when a technology of writing, a really key technology of writing, really imposed a carcan, imposed all sorts of limitations on non-Latin scripts, especially if you consider that the typewriter was really a technology that was produced for writing Latin characters. It was extremely impractical to type, for example, Chinese characters using a typewriter. Now that we are past the age of the typewriter, and now that we can use any standard digital device, a computer, a smartphone, to type dozens of scripts, technology doesn't play as big of a role in determining what scripts we can type and what scripts we cannot type. So if we're going with that kind of framework, then in the future, this global script regime will continue to change, because it has changed so far, and there's no reason to imagine that it will stop transforming. But we can surmise, perhaps, that the transformations in this global script regime will be not so much due to technology, perhaps, but due to other factors. Factors like religion, like identity, empire, the nation state. Those are the factors that we talked about in this video. There may be others. These are just some initial speculations. A couple of years from now, when my book is written, they may not stand. In the meantime, if you are interested in following my work, it's available on academia.edu. I'll be regularly updating it with what I publish. Thank you so much for listening to this talk today, and thank you again to the Japan Foundation for hosting it.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for this opportunity to moderate a talk between Professor Adal and myself. I'll call him Raja. And I hope you all enjoyed the recorded presentation. And I have the privilege of asking Raja some questions about his research that hopefully illuminates a little bit of what you, the audience, may be thinking about or wondering about. So as you can tell, Raja has been looking at a wide range of archives relating to script. And I was wondering if he might start us off by talking a little bit about what he found or what you found, Raja, to be either most surprising or interesting about your findings on World Script.
Thank you so much, Kay. It's really a pleasure to be here, and it's really great to get a chance to talk to you and to also talk to the audience and get your questions. So please feel free to ask any questions that you have. So there are a number of things that felt really were very exciting in this. I mean, for one, the global script regime is very, the transformations that occur are so dramatic, and they make you think that, scripts, a century from now, 2 centuries from now, it's going to look very different because it's looked very different in the past. And so thinking about, the world in this way was really interesting, right? I mean, you often think of the world in terms of, like European empires. Some people, refer to the West, that has often, that's I think quite common. And we've kind of been, come to think of the world in this way, but thinking of the world in terms of the world of Latin characters, the world of Arabic characters, it's a different perspective, and that was really, really fun. The other thing that's really fun are the difference in technologies, and the way that they transform dramatically. I mean, Kay, you can yourself, as someone who is, bilingual in, English and Japanese, how long does it, take you to write a text in English and to type the same text in Japanese? Is there a notable difference in the time that it takes to write English or Japanese?
I think the biggest difference, especially if it was a typewriter and of course not the modern computer that we now have, the biggest difference, of course, is the need to search for characters, simply because in Japanese there's just many more characters than there are in English and in the Latin alphabet. And so for most English typists, English language typists, they can touch type without ever looking at the keyboard. So in other words, the big difference is speed. Now, of course, the technology, as you mentioned, has changed this considerably, so that even for Japanese, it's much faster now to type on a computer. However, there still is this need to select characters. Now, the more practiced you are, the faster this happens, and also there's now adaptive language and AI, and the computer learns your most commonly used character combinations, and so it becomes faster and faster. But it's simply not the speed at which with English, where there's just phonetic characters, a set number of characters involved, where there's really no need whatsoever to look at what you're selecting.
Okay, so it is, there might be a certain advantage to typing in English in terms of speed, as opposed to typing in Japanese or in Chinese, for example, because you don't need to change the characters. But compared to the days of the typewriter, I think there's a huge difference in terms of practicality. And so this was really interesting. I mean, the fact that the technological challenges to typing in one script, or to writing essentially in one script instead of another, kind of vanished. Largely vanished and largely disappeared. For me, was really interesting. It also made me think about technologies of the future. And then there's really the relationship between the global script regime and technology, which it was a big deal. Like, for example, there's a book that was written by Umesao Tadao, which I have here, which is like called Nihongo to Jimu Kakumei. And and Umesao Tadao was a major figure in Japanese anthropology. And he was a strong believer in the abolition of kanjis, the abolition of Chinese characters in Japanese. He believed that, Japan would be better off just writing everything in hiragana. And so, in this book, there's prominently featured, certain, companies in Osaka that use hiragana typewriters. So typewriters that only have the one Japanese syllabary consisting of 48 characters on it. And this, he believed that this made Japanese much more practical and made these companies more efficient, and that this was the future. So I think in his mind, there's definitely a connection between the viability of Japanese as a modern language and technologies for writing Japanese. And this, today would be unthinkable. I think today, I don't think anyone could write a book like this today. I think it would be very strange to write a book like this, just because it's so easy to type in Japanese. But 50 years ago, this made sense. And so this was really, I think, this, all these issues were really fascinating for me.
Great. So, one of the other things that I think as a historian, you're particularly interested or, engaged in with, of course, are your sources. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about, when studying this topic, especially the history of it in Japan, tell us a little bit about some of the challenges you might have had with sources. What was particularly difficult, and in contrast, what perhaps makes Japan a particularly fruitful place to conduct this research? If you'll tell us a little bit about the archives and maybe your sources, I think the audience would be interested in that too.
Yeah, so I think, I use essentially maybe two kinds of sources. You can divide it in this way. One type is anecdotal sources. So like historians, they go on these raids in the archives, right? So, I would, go to various Japanese archives, National Library, Mitsui Archive, dozens of archives throughout Japan. I would go to archives in, India, in Egypt, in Lebanon, in Turkey. I went in various countries, and there you collect, documents and what catches your eye. It's like this kind of anecdotal evidence. And then you put it together, and you hope that it makes sense, right? As a narrative, right? As a story. There's also another type of sources which are much more systematic sources. And for that, for example, the way that I analyze the ethnologue, SIL ethnologue, data set here, which is the largest data set for languages that's available today. That's much more systematic, in that, of course, that data set is not perfect. No data set is, but it does kind of provide you with a global view, and it's much more systematic than kind of going in the archive and seeing what you find. The same thing with the Mitsui Miike Mine archive, right? So it's more than 30,000 pages of documents, and it allows me to chart in considerable detail the rise and decline of various instruments of writing, whether it's the pen, the pencil, the brush, the typewriter. And so, these were the two kind of types of archives that I use primarily. Now, sometimes you can't get to an archive, and it's often like, it's maddening, right? For example, I remember being on the phone with the company that bought over the Nihon Typewriter Kabushiki Gaisha, which is the Nihon typewriter company in the 1980s. And I asked them, do you have the archives for that company? And they said, yes, we do, but we can't show them to you. And, it's the kind of thing where it's there, but you can't quite get to it. The same thing in Egypt. I know that there are archives in the Egyptian National Archives that I want to get to, but I can't get permission. Not many people can't get permission. And my application has been pending for like 2 years. So, I'm still holding my breath. So, these are the kinds of limitations, right, that are inherent behind, this kind of work.
Yeah, so I guess even in Japan, there are some of these limitations, and it's, I guess it's very frustrating that it's so close yet so far. But once you get these archives and once you get your sources, I know that you mentioned that you really are engaged in various methods for understanding and studying script. And so I was wondering if you might tell us a little bit more about your methods. Help us see what we otherwise, what about your methods helps us to see what we otherwise might not see about scripts? I mean, we encounter script every day, but we don't think of it as something to engage with in terms of analysis. So could you tell us a little bit about maybe your engagement with digital humanities, and then also the contrast between close reading and distant reading? What about this really lets you grasp some meaning out of the script?
Yeah, so I mean, DH is one key aspect, right? The digital humanities. Another key aspect, I think, is the comparative method, right? So comparing Japan to other societies. So if you stick to just looking, for example, at the typewriter in Japan, the Wabun typewriter in Japan, the one that I just showed in the video, the issues at hand. What are the issues? Well, the big issues that are often talked about is, to keep kanji or to abolish kanji. Right, Umesawa Tadao wanted to abolish kanjis, right? And clearly the people who created this typewriter, the Wabun typewriter with the 3,000 plus characters, wanted to keep kanjis, right? And they saw it as a way to preserve kanjis. And you have these, somewhat heroic figures, like for example, the inventor of the first Japanese typewriter, the patent that I showed you in the video, Sugimoto Kyota. He was, he's listed in the website of the patent office, Japanese website of the Japanese patent office website. If you look at it, he's listed as one of Japan's top 10 inventors because he is seen as, maintaining Japanese, written with kanji characters. So this is, when you look at societies, like not individually, but in comparison. So when I look at Japan in comparison with South Asia, with West Asia, then things become, you look at things from higher up in the sense that this becomes an issue of what you could call the aesthetics of writing, right? So how you want your language to appear is not, whether you want to use kanji or not to use kanji in your writing is very similar to discussions that were taking place in South Asia about, what kind of characters, what kind of Devanagari characters should be included in modern Devanagari, what kind of the characters should be included in the modern typewriters, what shape should they have, to what extent in Arabic, for example, do you want characters that are kind of melded into one. In Arabic, sometimes you have multiple letters that are combined. How many of these combined letters do you want to keep? Because if you keep all of them, you end up with a huge typewriter that needs 600 keys, right? But they don't do that, right? They transform Arabic in order to adapt it to the technology, and then they try to develop technology that adapts to the script. And this is universal. It's not specific to Japan. And so this becomes really about the aesthetics of writing. The other thing that is there is technology, right? And in all of these societies, the invention of typewriters is a huge deal. Whether it's the Arabic typewriter, which is celebrated, the Devanagari typewriter, it's a moment when a lot of societies in the 20th century assert the independence of their culture and assert that their language and their culture and their script, it can actually survive and thrive in the modern world. And yeah, so this is, I think, the global comparative aspect of my work. And then the other aspect, which you mentioned, is looking at a large number of documents. And there you can look at larger trends, right? Such as the adoption of the typewriter, and you can do it very precisely. When you have 30,000 documents, for example, for the Mitsui Make Mine, you can exactly chart the rise of the use of the typewriter, the decline of the use of the brush. But then there's some documents that are still written in the brush, but the documents that are still written with the brush, those documents change, right? Instead of the brush being like the standard instrument for writing any formal letter, the brush becomes the standard instrument only for writing a letter to the president of the company, right? So it's much more. It becomes an instrument for a much more kind of gishiki, for a much more
ceremonial uses.
Ceremonial use, absolutely. So then,
we're kind of running out of time in terms of, when we want to open it up to sort of questions from the general audience. So I was going to end with asking you just one last question here, and then transit over back to Grace. So, today, as everyday people, we seem to have less opportunity actually to encounter script. I know that when I hold a pen to sign something, it's the rare occasion where I actually hold a pen, and audio and video are really taking its place. This comes in the form of like voice recognition. My children know how to say, okay, Google, and get all sorts of information. It's YouTube, it's TikTok, all of these things. And kids in schools, there's no more blackboard and chalk. There's no notebook and pencil. It's much more now being replaced by audio and video, especially under this pandemic. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the future, even though I know you're not engaged in crystal ball gazing. How might this kind of technological change the world of script? And what would be the role of technology there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there are a number of things. I mean, for one, there's, I've been talking mostly about the world of writing, but there is very much, when you're talking about, for example, voice recognition, you're writing about the interface between writing and voice, right? And so this is still kind of like, in some ways, a different area of research that I think is crucial and will be important in the future. The other one is, I mean, as you mentioned, video is so ubiquitous, and I think it's a lot of our students are, we teach, right? And a lot of our students are watching videos outside of class, but then in class they read mostly texts. And so this division between video and text, I think, needs to be bridged. And I think what the Japan Foundation is doing here, for example, with this video series is really one really necessary, a very important way of bridging this. I have my own little project, which is I'm planning on launching a YouTube channel about start out with about modern Japanese history, but then later on you might branch out. I'll have interviews with colleagues, and I'm planning on doing this in like a month or two. So it's anyone who's interested. I hope you can join, but yeah. So I don't know how much time we have. Is this?
We have a couple of minutes, but if you also want to talk a little bit about how your teaching allows you to sort of transform, what's on text into much more visual, sort of, whether it's your YouTube channel or, especially under this pandemic, how you've transformed your teaching so that text becomes more alive for your students, that would be of interest. Mm-hmm. What do you think about that and that transition?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's about a synergy between different media, right? And media scholars are very accustomed to talking about sound, vision, and like all of our senses. right? And so you can think of people as having, multiple channels, right? We have the visual channel, we have the oral channel, and then when we read text, that's still another way to kind of interface with knowledge. And if we use all of these different ways of interfacing with the world, right, and with the past, and then these things, there's a certain synergy that's created, and they build upon each other. So, in my classes, I assign texts, of course, but then I also supplement them with videos in which I have, visuals. And then of course there's like voice, there's also songs that are critical. And there's, also like, videos, like historical videos, at least in the 20th century when you have them. Japan has an amazingly rich, visual record. And, which, the Tokugawa period, the early modern period, modern Japan, it's amazing. And so we really have a wealth of documents to draw from. And I think it's really worth to use as many of these different media together as possible.
Okay, so I'm going to take up some of the questions from the audience that are being posted and see if, we can sort of incorporate that into our conversation here. So one is kind of going back to your earlier work, your first book, and I know one of the portions of it or chapters of it really concerns calligraphy. And so I have a question here about that. For Japanese language classes in elementary and secondary schools, I'm assuming in Japan, has the role of calligraphy or shuji practice changed? Or in particular, has it diminished since the advent of word processors and especially now with computers? And, how can these, sort of changes in technology keep us from losing maybe some of the, the depth of language that comes with writing and script?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, as you noted, like I initially became interested in this topic while working on my first book, which was about which was about drawing, music, and calligraphy education in modern Japan and Egypt. And so so calligraphy was really 1/3 of what the book, one of the 3 topics that the book dealt with. And in the documents about calligraphy, there were places where educators referred to the typewriter. And they said, well, in the future, because the whole idea with calligraphy was to teach, it wasn't so much to teach calligraphy. The beauty of writing was really secondary for most of modern Japanese history. With like, what was really important was to teach children to write in ways that were rapid and that were clear, right? Because speed and clarity of writing were seen as kind of essential techniques for having a successful, modern society. And so, some of these educators, who were in favor of calligraphy, of introducing calligraphy, of more calligraphy in schools, so in favor of the beauty of writing, will say, well, anyway, the typewriter in the future is going to make writing so much faster and so much clearer in Japanese, just like writing has become, so much faster and clearer in the world of Latin characters. Because in the world of Latin characters, typewriters, after a certain point can write, faster than longhand, right? And the idea is, well, this will happen in Japan too. And, longhand being the official way of writing, right? And in some ways, I think it's true, right? Today, I mean, it's faster to type a formal letter on a computer in Japanese than it is to write it by hand, right, in calligraphy. And
not to mention like sending it to all sorts of people all at once, right? I mean, just record production and communication itself is much faster.
Absolutely. So I think they were kind of imagining the world that we have today, right? And so in that world, they're arguing, well, writing can once again become about beauty and about self-expression, right? And interestingly, even calligraphy classes and writing classes never mixed. They were always separate, and they were in Japan, because the goals are very different, right? Writing is about functionality, calligraphy is about beauty and self-expression. And so I think today, calligraphy is established as a form of art, right? And so it's really a different realm from functional writing.
Can you kind of extend that to not just, within one language, but beyond one language? So, there's always this concern that minor languages are starting to become, quote unquote, extinct, especially as more countries sort of go towards English, and English becoming the more dominant language in the world. Especially in Asia, so many countries are concerned with English language education. And along with that comes, of course, script. So what do you think about this trend and what it might look like in the future, especially as technology also plays a role in making English the more dominant global language?
Yes, I think.
How would your map change?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good point. I mean, in that case, there's a clear difference between language and script. In that, I think you're absolutely right. The languages are dying, and SIL, ethnologue, there is definitely, and many other people are very concerned about the death of languages. Scripts, it's more complicated because when you look at the list of 154 scripts that are Unicode compatible today, a lot of the scripts that were, after the initial, 23 scripts or so, after that, what's published are mostly either historical scripts or scripts that are used by small communities. And a number of these scripts were actually invented in the 1980s. So scripts are, because it's, you have, for example, Nko is a typical example. It's in West Africa. It was invented by two brothers who felt like, who resented the fact that their language had to be written with Latin characters. And so they developed this script and it caught on, right? It touches on to a certain degree. The critical point is, does a script become a working script? Can you use it to get a driver's license? Is really kind of the
litmus test.
The litmus test, exactly, right? It's for a script, but for a lot of these communities, it's actually much easier to create a script today, and then to create to get it Unicode compatible, right? To make it possible to type it on a standard digital device is much more easier. Is much easier than it was in the age of the typewriter. So here you have a big advantage, and so you have people who very early on, for example, were sitting in studying engineering in the U.S. But at the same time they were devising a script for writing Ethiopic, right, before the age of Unicode, and then in the age of Unicode, it becomes all the easier. So now, there are various scripts that are being considered by the Unicode consortium, and that are currently have under application, people are applying to have them, to make them Unicode compatible. Some of these scripts are very, very rare. Some of them are used on, camels, for example. They were used to mark animals, and so I think it's much easier to create a script now than it was in the day of the typewriter.
Yeah, so maybe what technology is doing is making it go both ways, right? That it's shrinking the world of languages in one way, but in another way, it's allowing those who have, perhaps a very small population under its concern to also develop their own written text vis-a-vis the digital technology. And the digital technology really both makes it faster and cheaper. And I think the economics of it is also quite important. And I'm interested, as somebody asked also about, sort of how many Japanese typewriters still exist today, and where can they be found? Part of the, sort of difficulty of that is really the economics of building a typewriter and how few people were actually able to perhaps afford it, and that therefore most of it was in offices and bureaucracies, and that's not so anymore. Almost, anyone at least in the developed countries, and even in developing countries, have smartphones, and that's all you need. So I'm wondering if you might also talk a little bit about the economics of this, all of this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. There's an economic aspect, right, in that typewriters were expensive, right? They're like large machines. And it's not, it's also about like the custom, right? It's not customary for people to type, letters at home, right? In Japan, right? In the days of the typewriter, right? And so, in fact, it would probably be seen as rude, right? If you wrote like a New Year's card, 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, if you wrote a New Year's card, if you typed a New Year's card, it was seen as rude, right? And much less so now. So there is definitely that aspect, whereas, yeah. And so it was limited to companies, large companies, medium companies. There's also a very interesting kind of gender aspect to this, which is that you go from having male managers who sometimes have secretaries who write for them, but most of the time are writing letters in their own hand, to male managers who are passing on these letters, writing a quick rough draft, sending it on to the typewriter pool. And there you have women who are typing it up. Once again, with the word processor in the 1980s, you have all of these male managers, right? All these white collar workers who are learning to type on their own letters on these word processors, and then later on the computer, right? So there's a dramatic transformation that occurs, and and a really interesting kind of interplay between kind of textual production, right, what you write, and gender issues.
Okay, Grace, should we pass it on to you for a bit?
Sure. Yeah. So we have one or two questions that were collected before the live started this evening. But if you have any questions, please get them in now in the last few minutes of our presentation. Live audience, please use that chat box. So I'm going to start with a question that we got earlier. And I wonder how much this plays into where typewriters were used and who used them. I'm wondering roughly how many Japanese typewriters still exist, do you know? I'm thinking about typewriters. Latin typewriters here in the US are often decor objects that you might find in somebody's home. But in Japan, do typewriters still exist? Are there still a large number of them? Are they in private collections? Are they collected by museums? Do any businesses still use them? So if you know anything about that, we'd be curious to hear.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't own any typewriters myself, whether Latin typewriters or Japanese typewriters for that matter. But I have been in contact with people who, with typists, with people who are former typists, with people who service these typewriters, with people who sell the kind of the key, right, the letters for these typewriters. And the last shop, to my knowledge, that sold slugs for Japanese typewriters. And these slugs are important because you have a tray for 3,000 characters, but that tray doesn't necessarily include all the characters that you need for specialized use. So you might need specialized characters for, a particular scientific field or for a particular name, right? Somebody in your company might have and so you need to go and buy these slugs. That last shop was essentially went out of business in 2010. I went there and I actually talked to the owner and got some photos. So there, but then I think apparently their collections were transferred to the printing museum in Tokyo. Okay. I haven't followed up on that, but it would be interesting to see if the printing museum, if they're doing anything with it. I don't, otherwise, I mean, I think it's possible to get, Wabun typewriters in Japan today. It's not cheap at all. I think it's probably the same price as it was, about $2,000 maybe for a typewriter as it was in the days of the typewriter, right? Like a few decades ago. But I don't have any doubt really that I think interest in typewriters will rise again. So soon, Tom Mulaney's book about the Chinese typewriter will appear in Japanese translation, and I think that will, bring interest to some of the, the mechanics of the typewriter. My work, has appeared in still limited. I mean, in Japanese, but in very I have very short pieces that have appeared. So I think there, often it's at the end of an era, right? It's that historical interest in that topic rises, right? What is it? What's Hegel's term, right? The owl of Minerva rises at dusk, right? And so it's often the case with historical topics like this. But I think it's not so much, it's not so much antiquarian interest in the typewriter that's really going to make people interested in typewriters. What's going to make people interested in typewriters is the relevance of these issues to issues that we face today, right? To issues that are related to, voice recognition, to, our use of smartphones, to like the entire kind of media ecology that surrounds the act of writing. And how can historical knowledge in the past actually help us to understand our current predicament and where we're heading to in the future?
Thank you. I suppose we'll have to wait for the next NHK drama that makes typewriters popular again, and we'll see a surge. I have another question that we collected before tonight's live session that I'm not sure if we touched on completely. You talked a little bit about the democratization of writing access with a typewriter. Are there any typical ergonomic features that are common among writing technologies? For example, features that accommodate disabilities. And I wonder if this might be a topic that could bridge how typewriters were used decades ago to how writing technologies are used now. Are there any commonalities across the board?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, there was definitely talk, especially, I mean, with the Latin typewriter, the relationship between blindness and the Latin typewriter is definitely something that was discussed in the early 20th century, and it's because obviously you can blind touch, right? After you can touch type, right? It's right on a Latin typewriter. With the Japanese typewriter, that's not really so much the case. I mean, because you're actually you have 3,000 characters on a tray, so it's really helpful. I mean, you have seeing where your typewriter, which characters you're picking is really crucial. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. So while we wait to see if there's any more YouTube comments, maybe you could let us know, was there anything that you didn't have time to include in your lecture tonight? Anything that you found interesting, maybe a small tidbit or a whole segue that you'd like to add now?
Sure.
I think if you might talk a little bit about your, future projects and how, this research kind of fits with your other projects. What have you learned, and how is that going to inform what you're going to do next?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. So, this current project, this current book really is about the relationship between technology and writing, right? The material history of writing. And that's kind of led me to really be interested in what I call like instruments of certification, things like stamps or signatures. In that, what's really fascinating about that is that both stamps and signatures are forgeable, right? If with a bit of work, someone can forge them, right? And that's also the case with digital signatures, right? With a bit of work, you can forge them. And yet, for, like more than a century, the entire kind of legal system, right? Much of the legal system, much of the, like when you go to a bank, when you go to, when you sign a contract, it's all based on like signatures. And in Japan, it's often the hanko, right? The stamp. Right. So this brings up the question, well, if it's so forgeable, why, how can we actually base our entire, social institutions, right, on this basis? And I think this relates to the questions of social trust, right? And how is social trust and trust in our institutions and trust in each other kind of constructed through these instruments? And I think it's constructed in ways that are not necessarily obvious to us. I think we have kind of assumed that it was the technical aspect of these instruments of stamps or of signatures that actually made them dependable, and made it so that we believed something that was signed or that was stamped. But in fact, I don't think that's the case. I think there's other things that are functioning there in creating social trust. This is an interesting issue. I mean, Kay, you experienced yourself, recently, and with COVID-19, the Hanko has kind of gone out of business, right? And this has been a political issue in Japan also, right?
With this pandemic, one of the first things that Japanese bureaucrats realized was that they couldn't get to the office to get their hanko, so no paper moved, and so none of the business got done. And so this new administration under Prime Minister Suga, one of its first jobs is to get rid of the entire hanko system, or at least to the extent possible. And that is going to put a lot of people out of business. So I think that, for a nation that's depended so much on these, I guess, somewhat outdated ways of signing and recognition of identity, your research will be very timely and really interesting to figure out, what is going to change in terms of bureaucratic or power structure relationships as these signatures and stamps disappear.
Yeah, and I think there absolutely, and I think there are also other ways in hankos are used in other ways also. For example, in the Mitsui Mikiman archive that I have, they're used. So you have documents, for example, that are stamped by multiple people. Some of them have more than a dozen stamps, right? And looking at the stamps, and I'm doing kind of a big data, machine learning, analysis of this entire archive to figure out, all of the stamps. There are more than, and these 30,000 plus documents, there are more than 100,000 stamps to figure out, how exactly the stamps were being used. But I think it's very interesting because it shows you the path that a document takes within the company. Because whenever it shows up on someone's desk, they stamp it with a particular stamp, and so the stamp is very much related to the way that paperwork is processed and circulates within companies and outside of companies. And so, all these practices obviously have to be revised when you get rid of the stamp.
I'm also wondering if that might also change sort of individual identity, much like the way, as you mentioned, the brush. Oftentimes, people who are very practiced with reading brush writing could identify the person who wrote it based on the brush writing, right? With characteristics of that person's writing style. And once that transferred over to the typewriter and then to the word processor, of course, this eliminated that level of individual identification. And the hanko in some ways does play a similar role in that, of course, there's the shakuhachi, the sort of the mitome, in which you can buy for 100 yen at the convenience store. But then there's also the specialized stamps that are very much tied to an individual. And some people even make nicks in the stamp in special places so that it's only tied to that one person. And so by removing those stamps that are more tied to the individual and making it more generalizable, that is closer to the typed version of scripts, I wonder if that also removes some sort of individual identity from signatures to just maybe the role of the person, like president or manager, as opposed to manager so-and-so, an individual.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, it removes a certain tactile, aspect to documents. But I think hanko you often had, assistants who had the hanko of their boss, right, and who used that, right? So it also works differently than signatures. And the difference, I think, between signatures and hanko, and also with handwriting, is that there's often a sense that handwriting leaves a sediment of the writer's body on the page. And so so that's, it's a form of people kind of show off how beautiful their calligraphy is, when they write these letters. And, it shows off an aspect of themselves, right? It can show off, how much care they took in writing the letter, right? How concentrated they were when writing it. It can also be a form of loyalty, right? If you take the time to write a beautifully calligraphed letter to the company president, it's saying something about your loyalty, right? And the care that you're putting into this. And so that's a bit different from the hanko. But I still have to figure out exactly what, hankos mean when and in what cases. And for that, I'm going to do, like I did here, I'm going to do both a distant reading and a close reading. So look at, tens of thousands of documents, but also look at very particular documents and try to figure out exactly what the meanings of these documents were and how they differed from signatures or did not differ from the signatures. And these, look into these kinds of issues.
Great. Well, back to you, Grace.
Thank you so much. And I hope there will still be some hanko shops when we are out of quarantine so that you can go visit some of these places in person as well. So thank you everybody so much for joining us this evening. Dr. Adal, was there anything that you wanted to mention about your forthcoming YouTube channel or any sort of ways that we can find you online? Stay posted with updates?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, you can find me on academia.edu. That's where I usually post the things that I publish, and I'll also post something about my YouTube channel on there. So it'll be findable. Obviously, you can look for it on YouTube. But this is all kind of it's very exciting for me. It's also new territory. But so I'm very much looking forward to kind of going away from just writing papers to also producing videos.
Well, we're looking forward to watching, so we'll have to keep an eye out on academia.edu. So with that, that's all the time we have for tonight. Thank you everybody so much who watched us live this evening. If you would like to learn more about fellowship funding, or if you would like to read more information about our speaker and our moderator this evening, all of that information can be found in the description box below this video. So with that, I will say good night and thank you so much for speaking this evening. And thank you so much, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you so much.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.